Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the JG7's classroom series and the second episode about aircraft performance. In the first episode, we've looked at some fundamentals of flying, the physics behind it, and aircraft performance in level flight or straight flight, both level and the climb, because both are important eventually when we talk about dogfighting. And for those who are new to this series is about aerial combat in or focusing on a World War II environment, but some of the principles may be applied to modern air combat as well. I'm your host and instructor Killerfliege, and without further ado, let's dive into chapter 3 of the performance series, mini-series within our classroom series. Alright, so as we've talked about straight flight last time, now we are going to look at the performance limits in accelerated flight. And by accelerated flight, I refer to turns, or turn flight in particular. Why is the turn flight an accelerated flight? Well, we shall look at this from a physical perspective. After all, an airplane is moving on a circle. If you fly it well, it's a concentric circle with a given radius r. Your airplane has a specific mass m, and you fly at a certain velocity t, or vt, which is tangential to the circle. Now, of course, to stay on that circle, there must be a force acting on that plane, on that mass, pointing toward the center of that circle, which keeps you which pulls the plane around that circle, or your turn. Hence, your velocity, which, if you remember your physics lessons, velocity is a vectorial quantity. It needs direction and magnitude. Even if the magnitude stays the same, the direction of your velocity vector is changed. If your mass is here, it points this way. If your mass is here, it points this way. And every time the velocity vector is changed, we have acceleration. Hence, the turn is an accelerated flight. Now, in this picture, which is a standard picture that you would see in your physics books explaining circular motion, you have the most important quantities shown that are also important for us when we are talking about dogfighting. So as I said, we have a specific radius r, we have a tangential velocity vt, our airplane has a specific mass which we can somewhat influence depending on the load that we are carrying, and we have a centripetal force that's pulling us around the turn, and we will need to talk about how this comes to be, because obviously there is no magic rope attached to our plane that's pulling us around this center of the turn here. And we have a specific turn rate, which is the angle we cover per time, tr or omega or phi dot. Alright, so these are the values that or quantities that we need to look at and that we want to manipulate, as we will have to talk about how to manipulate these contacts to boost our performance to the maximum. Now, on the left here, as I said, I've explained the different quantities that are acting here. The only thing that's not shown in the picture is our centripetal acceleration, but obviously this acts along the centripetal force, because eventually this acceleration is what's causing this vector to bend. And you also may remember that force equals A times m, so we will see that in a bit anyway. Radius, mass, tangential velocity, radial velocity. This is obviously resulting from the centripetal acceleration. But for our dogfighting, or in terms of the quantities that we can influence, this one is less important. I've just shown it anyway to keep you aware that this is here. Okay. And it actually describes the change of velocity vector per increment, if you will. Alright, then we have the turn rate, TR or omega. I will use omega from here on forth, and it can be measured in degrees per second, or degrees per time, or radians per time. So usually in SI units we use rads per time and not the degrees, but it's the same thing. So it tells you how much of the circle you cover in a given time. Okay, and then we have the change of angle over time, which is V dot, and as you may see, angle over time is the same as turn rate, so V dot is the same as turn rate. The reason you write it like this is you indicate that turn rate is a derivative of angle with respect to time. Okay, so whenever you see a dot over a quantity, it is with respect to time dt, time increment. And we have our circular arc that we cover, in this case in a small quantity, so ds or s, and obviously our angle covered, phi. Alright, let's look at the right side real quick to find certain relationships already between the different quantities. Now, if we look at this picture here for a second, we can find a relationship between the distance. So the arc is basically literally the distance in meters or feet or whatever you cover with a respective angle, and with respect to just the radius. So if we look at this, we can see where it comes from. So we are looking at a small increment, so we are looking at here radius r. We assume that the circle has a constant radius, so at time t0 or t0 we are here at the distance of radius r from the turn center, and at time t1, which is just a very short time after that, we are here still at radius r, distance from the center, and that means we've covered this arc. Now if we maintain a very, very small distance, this is more or less a straight line between here and here, and technically the relationship would be sine of phi times r, ds is r times the angle, because it is small angles, so times sine of phi, r times sine of phi. But because it's a small angle, we can assume that sine phi is roughly phi, so the angle itself. So this is where this comes from. Just remember, the arc is radius times angle. Okay, and if you wanted to do larger distances, we just integrate it. We would write integral ds is r times integral d phi. Okay, and then we integrate that equation. We don't have to do that now. Yeah, and in terms of velocity, we can find that Vr, the tangential velocity, is basically the change of velocity. Again, here, same example, we have the velocity Vt at this point, at t0, pointing directly east, if you will. And a short increment later, we have the velocity still at the same magnitude. We are assuming we are flying at constant tangential velocity in terms of magnitude. again, same story. The difference in velocity is dependent on the angle, and with the trigonometry that we know, we could find that, but we'll get to that. Right. So here are some equations now that we will need to use to do our performance discussion. So first of all, what we have to ask ourselves is obviously, what quantities can we manage as a pilot? And that, again, to optimize our turn performance. Obviously, we want to manipulate our tangential velocity, and that we can easily by pulling harder, or by reducing throttle, or by increasing throttle. We can manipulate the radius of the turn, and we can manipulate the centripetal force, as we shall see soon, because we can actively create and destroy this force by manipulating the aircraft's controls. Okay, so these three forces are the ones that we want to look at for now, but obviously a very important one is also turn rate, and we will see how turn rate is connected to the others. Okay, now that this is squared away, we need to figure out how to optimize those. So let's do some math. And obviously, as we always do in dynamics or motions, kinematics, we are looking at Newton's law, and we start with F equals mass times acceleration. Since we are in a circular motion, we give some indices to indicate what kind of force and acceleration we are looking for. Centripetal force, and centripetal acceleration. So this will be our first fundamental equation. Fz equals m times az. Okay. Based on this, we will do our further calculations, more or less. Now we need to find a relationship, or we need to work with this fundamental equation. So we need to find a relationship between Fz, Vt, and omega. Okay, so the first thing we are looking at, and this is why we've done that, is we look at the distance that we cover. And we've already established that the distance that we cover, the arc, is the radius times the angle covered. In this case, in radians, okay? To stay true to SI units. Okay? So now we want to see, or we want to derive a speed. And speed is nothing else but, and we've talked about this briefly last time, distance covered over time. So the distance covered, we could write s dot or ds over dt, which is our distance covered over time. And this is our tangential velocity, because our arc is basically parallel or in the same direction as our tangential velocity. So our tangential velocity is then r, radius, times, because this stays constant, this doesn't change over time, but what changes over time is our angle. So if we, put distance into respect, or let's say relation with time, we need to do it on the opposite side of the equation as well. So we find this, and we've already established what this is. So dphi over dt is our phi dot, and in other words is our turn rate. Awesome. So our tangential velocity is directly correlated with our turn rate and the radius of our turn, which are two very important quantities of our turn in terms of turn performance. So this is a very important equation here that we need to remember. Alright, and that we'll use. Now, eventually we want to find a relationship between these quantities. So the next thing we're looking at is our centripetal acceleration. And we know that acceleration is the time derivative of speed. Awesome. We've already established what speeds we're looking at. And now if we're looking at this side of the picture, the change of speed, because this change of speed is exactly the derivative we are looking for with regards to the acceleration, is nothing but the sine of phi times tangential velocity. Okay, this dv is what we are looking at right now. dv is vt times sine phi, and because we are looking at very, very small angles, we can roughly assume that it's vt times phi. Alright, awesome. Now all we gotta do is we have to find the time derivative to find acceleration. So we find acceleration is the time derivative of dv. We write it like this. Now we've already established vt shall stay constant in our discussion, because we want to fly a turn at constant velocity, to fly an energy neutral turn. We don't want to gain speed, and we don't want to kill speed either, because if we kill speed, we are getting slower. Eventually we will have to trade altitude, and we will fall out of the sky. If we gain speed throughout the turn, we are not optimizing the turn performance, obviously, because we could turn a bit harder. Okay, so which is why this magnitude of Vt assumed to be constant, or is supposed to be constant in our discussion, is a good approach. And so if we talk about the derivative, this is constant over time, so we don't have to consider this in terms of the time derivative, but the angle obviously changes. So we get this equation, and now this is awesome. Now when we look at our centripetal acceleration, we can find this, because we already know what d phi over dt is. We've just established this here. Okay, we've established that turn rate, we are using this equation, and yeah, we get here. So d phi over dt is obviously omega, and we've already established, this is what I wanted to say, what Vt is, because it's r times omega, and then we end up with this equation. So looking at the acceleration, and then obviously the acceleration is directly connected to our centripetal force, we have a quadratic relationship between a turn rate and acceleration, and a linear relationship between turn rate and acceleration and radius. So this is very important. Now obviously turn rate is a bit hard to read in the cockpit, so but the good thing is that turn rate is directly correlated to speed, which we can read in the cockpit. We can write the centripetal acceleration in terms of speed as well, and we get to this equation. If we just replace omega, because omega is, now we look at this equation, is Vt over r, okay, and we put this in here, so this is our omega squared, okay, and then one of the r cancels out, this one here, and we end up with Vt squared times r. So again, centripetal acceleration is in a quadratic relationship with tangential velocity, and an inverse reciprocal relationship with r. Okay, so if we look at the acceleration, just a quick check, how do we increase it? We would have to increase a vt and at the same time decrease r, because the smaller this is, the greater this gets. And why would we want to increase or maximize our acceleration? Because with maximum acceleration we have a maximum, let's say, bend of the velocity vector, which means, in simple terms, which means that we can change direction more quickly, hence a tighter turn or a higher turn rate. But we will look at this if this is true, because there are certain trade-offs. Alright, now that we've established the fundamentals of circular motion, and as I've promised last time, you don't need physics books here to understand, that's why we've gone through this. Obviously you could have looked that up in your physics books as well, but I wanted to do it from the start, so bear with me. As a short summary here, the 4 fundamental equations that we found and that we will use now when we look at this as an aircraft turning problem, okay? Because this is the next we are going to do. So, here it is. Now, as you can see here, this is the turn our aircraft does, and we simply assume, in this case, our aircraft is a mass or a distribution of mass. For the simplicity's sake, we assume the aircraft is a point mass or has its mass concentrated in its center of gravity, and then we can work this problem or solve this problem the same way we've solved circular motion before. But what we want to look at is how do we generate certain things. Obviously the tangential velocity is more or less a product of your thrust and drag. Thrust and drag are antagonists, obviously, as we've established in the last series, or episode, not series. And we want to look at how to actually generate the centripetal force, as I said before, because there is no magic rope attached to our plane that's pulling us around this turn center, so we need to see how we generate this force. And you all are consciously or subconsciously aware of what you're actually doing when you fly or initiate a turn. So you're at straight and level flight, or in straight and level flight, this scenario. Wings level, everything is fine. And in this scenario, obviously your lift is perpendicular to your motion. You're moving toward us here. So obviously the lift is perpendicular to this plane indicated by the dashed line, and it is opposite in direction to weight. And to maintain altitude, lift and weight need to be equal. So these are the fundamental equations that we've established last time. Now, in order to initiate a turn, what we do is we bank the aircraft, for example in this case, to the left. Bear with me, we are looking at the front of the aircraft, not the back, so this plane is banking left, but it doesn't matter. Now, as you can see here, the wing surface area is tilted by a bank angle beta. This also means that we tilt our lift vector, because we've talked about it. Lift is more or less perpendicular to the surface generating it, or technically perpendicular to the airflow. So this plane has changed, so we are tilting our lift vector. And now, interestingly, the lift vector is not aligned perfectly opposite with the weight anymore. Okay, so if we don't do anything, if we just bank here and we tilt the lift vector, what would you expect to happen? Well, the aircraft would drift slightly to the left, and it will also sink, because looking at the lift vector, obviously we have a component still a component that is opposite and parallel to weight, which is our vertical lift component, and we also have a horizontal lift component. So we are just splitting the forces into their respective components with regards to the two dimensions we are looking at. Let's say x and vertical, okay, or horizontal and vertical. Alright, and obviously we have the bank angle here as well between these two. And if we don't change that, now obviously again we would use trigonometry and find the vertical lift component is L times cosine of beta. So with the relationship cosine of beta, because cosine of beta is 1 at 0 angle, and as soon as we induce angle greater than 0 degrees, this will decrease in value, okay? And if we don't increase our total lift component by the same amount, this will be smaller than this, and then we would sink. So in other words, in order to maintain altitude also in a turn flight, because we tilted lift vector, we need to increase the total lift vector. So this equation comes true. Okay, so we've changed from this to this. Okay, so we introduced this component, this cosine component is new. Alright, and why are we tilting the lift vector? Because, awesome, look at this. The horizontal lift component is obviously a component of this total force that's pulling us along this dashed line, which is this dashed line here in this picture, and that means this horizontal lift component correlates directly with the centripetal force. Technically, this horizontal lift component is our centripetal force. This is the thing, the force, that's pulling us around this turn. Now, how do we increase that lift force? Okay, which is necessary, as we've established. Well, we've looked at our alpha CL diagram, and we've established that if we increase our alpha, so we increase our alpha, we walk up this path, and we then increase our we increase our CL. Okay, so how do we do that? We introduce alpha. How do we introduce alpha? We pull on the elevator, which is the reason why when you fly through a turn you also pull on the elevator. Is to increase that lift force to maintain this altitude. Now, as I said, this is something that most of you probably do subconsciously anyway, but now you know the reason why. Okay, so now that this is squared away and we found a relationship or a way to calculate the vertical lift component, we can also find a way to calculate our centripetal force, which is simply the sine beta times lift. And that means, as you can see, the vertical lift component decreases with increasing beta. The horizontal lift component increases with increasing beta. It's just simply the way sine and cosine work. Alright, so this is important that we've established that. Now, why do we, or what can we do with that in terms of aircraft performance? We can actually determine what so-called load factor is. Now, this is some of the summary or the observations that we made. Obviously, LH, our horizontal lift component, is our centripetal force, very important. The reduced vertical lift component with respect to straight flight needs to be compensated, or needs now to counteract weight, which means we have to increase our total lift, okay, increased with respect to level flight, and this increase is achieved by increasing AOA, pull back on the elevator. Alright, so the cool thing is, because we've looked at the equations, there's a direct correlation between the increase and the bank angle, and this is this. Now if we solve for lift, we can write down that lift, because LV is supposed to be the same as weight, so we are looking at this part of this equation. L equals weight divided by cosine beta, and because we divide by cosine beta, this is going to increase. So this component is, so to speak, increasing the real weight, so to speak. I wouldn't say artificially, but yeah, bear with me. And if we rearrange a little bit, we write lift in relation to weight, lift to weight ratio, so to speak, is then 1 over cosine beta. So, and this, in other words, is just a ratio that tells you how much more lift do I need with respect to weight at a given bank angle. And then we just define that this here, as it's written here, that this ratio, or this term, 1 over cosine beta, we define this as the load factor. Let's make an example to make this clear, how this is useful. And we use 60 degrees of bank angle for now, because it's giving you nice numbers. We use that same equation from above. How much more lift do we need at 60 degrees bank angle with respect to straight flight? Or, yeah. So we plug in the numbers. Cosine of 60 degrees is 1/2. Now if we do weight over 1 over 2, that obviously equals 2 times weight. Alright, so we need to double the lift at 60 degrees bank with respect to, or compared to, straight flight to maintain altitude. And this is very significant. And the load factor technically is not the g-force, but it is correlated directly to the g-force. So load factor 2 simply means we are experiencing 2g. Because the lift is obviously twice that compared to level flight. It's 2g. It's yeah. We would have to simply, you know, write the weight in mass, m mass times gravitational constant. Weight is mass times gravitational constant, and there you go. So 2g times m, if you will. Okay, this is where this comes from. The load factor technically doesn't have the g attached to it, but you can tell a load factor of 2 means effectively the pilot will experience in the plane 2g, 3g, and so on. So it's written here. Okay, so that is a very significant observation that we made here. So now, again, load factor is simply the relationship between lift to weight, and for our problem in the turn, we can find this relationship is 1 over cosine beta, okay, for the turn flight. Alright, awesome. We've learned a lot so far just by looking at it. This problem, simple problem, and now we can do some math with it, because now we want to know, obviously, do we have any changes on our performance limits that we've talked about earlier? For example, stall speed. How slow can I fly in a turn? The same as compared to straight flight, or not? And that's what we are going to look at now. So we've already established in the last series that our stall speed in straight flight, Vs0 or Vs0, is square root of 2 times the weight, or weight equals lift, remember, divided by rho times CL max times S. This simply comes from the lift equation. Okay, if you don't know, I recommend you watch the first episode of this series. Now, we have this new condition now in our turn flight. So lift now is not simply weight, but is weight divided by cosine beta. And obviously, yeah, this is our lift equation here. So we rearrange this again because we want to find the speed. We do some math. If this is a bit too fast or you want to do it yourself, pause the video, but we are just basically rearranging this equation. So we come to the term v squared is this, and since this is simply a term that we add this 1 over cosine, we can write it, let's say, isolated, and then we have this part here of the equation, which simply is the stall speed at level flight times 1 over cosine beta. We've already established this is our load factor n. Now we solve for speed by putting the square root over it, so we get this. Now we have again our Vs. This is our Vs naught, and this is our square root load factor. Sorry. We can obviously rearrange this to take the n out of this one big chunk of square root, which is here, and we also say we want to fly at stall speed because, sorry, this is just in general with regards to alpha. This is our speed with regards to alpha in general, not our Vs naught. So this is just our Vs. Okay. Now we are talking about alpha max, CL max, because we want to fly at the maximum alpha, which is where we're going to find our stall speed. So we plug in CL max in here, and then we get Vs naught, and we find this equation. So awesome. We can actually now determine, depending on our load factor, we can also write this equation if it's easier for you. We write a beta here equals square root of 1 over cosine beta times Vs naught. Now, without doing flight test, of course, flight test to verify your findings, but technically without doing a flight test, you can now determine the stall speeds of your aircraft at all possible load factors, ergo bank angles. All you need to know is the stall speed in level straight flight, and this you usually get from a manual. So for example, if I wanted to know the stall speed of my plane at 60 degrees of bank, all I do is I use this equation and I put in the respective load factor. Now, to do a performance table or a stall speed table, depending on your bank angle, all you have to do is you take out an Excel sheet, you write down all the bank angles that you can possibly think of, maybe in 5 steps, 5 degree steps, or 1 degree steps if you want to go that crazy, but 5 degree steps usually are enough, or 10 degree steps. And then you plug in this plug them into this equation, and then you get your stall speeds, and then you have a table that you could potentially print and look at. And whenever you fly, and you see, for example, the P-51 does have an accelerometer inside, so it actually tells you the g-force, and you read a specific g-force, you can look at your table or simply do the math yourself real quick, plug this in here, and you know what speed you can fly at this particular load factor. How awesome is that? And I highly recommend you do that for the plane you usually fly, because that will come in extremely handy when you do aerial combat. See, this is a very, very important equation here. Every pilot needs to know this. Also, when you do general pilot training, this is an equation that you need to learn. That they will test, at least here in Germany. In in the theoretical exam. Okay, and you need to know where it comes from. So this is the concept of load factor. Now we've determined our first performance limit in accelerated flight, which is our stall speed. And we found that it's directly correlated to bank angle. And as you can see, stall speed is not correlated to anything else. We know the stall speed at straight and level flight. Now, you can see obviously stall speed in straight and level flight is dependent on our weight and our altitude, which is indirectly given by the density, air density, okay? And also the speed. And what we've established in the last episode as well is that if you reduce weight, increase wing surface area, for example by deploying flaps, and you go down in altitude, you will have the slowest stall speed. As you go higher, your stall speed will generally be higher, but in terms of indicated speed, it's going to stay the same. Yeah, in the cockpit indicated, it's always the same because your speedometer, your velocity indicator also, even if you maintain the speed going higher, it will show a decreasing speed because obviously the density decreases, and because it's generally a pressure measurement tool and one pressure value is linked to one specific speed value. So even if the speed stays the same but the pressure goes down as you go higher, the indicated speed will go low. So this is handy. So no matter how high you fly, you will always stall at the same indicated speed, but bear in mind the true speed would be higher as compared to low level flying. So bear this in mind, and this obviously translates directly to our stall speed. So the higher we go in terms of bank angle, the higher our stall speed is going to be. But we can use the same measures to decrease that by simply decreasing Vs naught. We cannot decrease the load factor, obviously, per se, only by reducing bank angle. Okay. Whew. I hope you're still with me. I know it was a bit much, but if you go over the material slowly, maybe pause at given times, I'm pretty sure you can wrap your head around that, I hope. Alright, now, awesome. We've done a great step, because now what this enables us to do, with all the limits that we've talked about already, we can write a so-called, or draw a so-called flight envelope, or a V-n-Diagramme. V-n, why? Because we plot load factor over velocity, and we look at the limits, which are these curves. So I've drawn them out for you already, the flight envelope, and now let's look at, this is how a flight envelope generally looks like. Bear in mind, this is for upright flight only. I haven't included inverted flying, but inverted flying would look somewhat like this. Obviously we would have to go a dashed line here, because generally we cannot fly lower than 1 g, but we would, if we go inverted or push the nose down, we would achieve that, and then we would have something like this. Maybe not as far, and somewhat like this. So that would be inverted. But this is not really relevant for us for World War II planes, because the engines don't like inverted flight for extended periods of time, and we would want to avoid that anyway. So we are just looking at the positive G side, if you will, of this envelope. So what have we established in the last video? Obviously we have a structural limit at our never exceed speed, because if we go over our never exceed speed, we could risk structural damage to the aircraft. So we wouldn't want to go beyond our never exceed speed. And whether we are in a dive, in a climb, or in a turn, given in a turn you would probably not reach that, we don't want to go beyond our never exceed speed. So this is a hard cut here. Then we have a maximum load factor that our plane can handle, or our pilot can handle. So we will have a maximum load factor beyond which the plane will suffer again structural damage. Okay, so the load factor limit and the speed limit are basically structural limits. Now, if we consider the pilot as well, maybe N max will be a bit lower, because usually the pilot is the lower limit with regards to the maximum load factor, because some people may black out at 6G, some may be able to pull 9G, but at some point an airframe may be doing 10 or 12 Gs, but the pilot won't be able. But we are talking about the aircraft, so we maintain the structural limit. And here, this is what we've just established. We have our lift limit depending on the load factor, and we've seen that this is depending on the load factor. If we write it down like this, we rearrange this equation because now velocity is our variable and load factor is our dependable. So we just rearrange this. We write n on the left side, and we have to inverse the velocity. We have to square it, and yeah. So this is obviously what we get. So we have this factor here comes from our, as you see, stall speed at straight and level flight, and then our stall speed depending on the load factor is what we can plot here. And it's a quadratic relationship, which is why it's gonna show a quadratic feature in terms of how the graph looks like. So important is that this is our lift limit at 1G and or load factor 1. Obviously we will find our stall speed in straight and level flight. Below that, obviously the plane does not fly. It basically falls to the ground. Okay, and as you can see, as we go higher with speed, our load factor will increase, our load factor will increase, our load factor will increase, and at some point the lift limit reaches the structural limit. Okay, N max, so basically maximum load factor. And then we cannot increase the load factor any further, which is why this graph or line here flattens out, so to speak. And because, as you can see, this looks like a corner, this is why this point here is called corner speed. This is the corner speed of our flight envelope. And as we will learn, this becomes important with regards to aircraft performance. Okay? Because the corner speed, as we will learn, is the speed at which we have best turn performance. Alright. Let's see if there's anything else. Nope. Okay. So basically this flight envelope is more or less the summary of chapters 1 to 3, okay, with regards to aircraft performance. We've established limits in straight and level flight. I'm not talking about the climb performance here, but generally, yeah, we've established performance limits in straight flight. We've established performance limits in accelerated flight, and now we put this all together in one graph and we get our flight envelope. So what you should take away from this episode is the following. This equation, stall speed in accelerated flight, is directly correlated to load factor. The load factor is directly correlated to our bank angle. So higher the bank angle, higher the load factor, because the more you need to increase the lift to maintain a level or maintain altitude. And yeah, this is technically the most important takeaway here. And your centripetal force is generated by tilting the lift vector because then you generate a horizontal lift component that's pulling you around the turn. And in order to increase that lift, that total lift vector, because we learned we need to increase that total lift vector, we need to pull more AOA, which is why we pull on the elevator when we fly through a turn, and we maintain that pull on the elevator as we go through the turn. Alright, now that's it for me for this episode. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you could learn something and this is useful for you, and catch you in the next one. Killer Flyge out.